Hello, everybody, and welcome to the session on embedding equity considerations into your consulting practice. My name is Naaima Khan, and I am based on unceded Wapikute and Shakowin territory, also known as St. Paul, Minnesota. I begin my sessions with a land acknowledgement because no matter where each of us is located, we reside on traditional homelands of Indigenous people, lands that were cultivated by both Indigenous people and those who were forcibly enslaved from other continents. Land and enslavement acknowledgements do not exist in the past tense. They are part of recognizing ongoing white supremacist ideology that continues to impact us all today. It is essential to take the time to understand the history that brought us to reside on and benefit from these lands, and to name our power in changing structural inequities. And to me, this is a really big purpose of embedding equity into our evaluation practice, right? Is the why. The why behind it is embedding equity into evaluation puts data to its most effective use, which is truth telling, particularly in the context of our quest for shared liberation and the uplifting of all communities, especially those who are historically excluded and underrepresented. So for me, this topic really represents a huge opportunity that our field has to add to the national conversation, as some have called it, a racial reckoning. And in my experience of having just observed the movement of the field within the past, 5-7 years, having attended an AEA conference maybe 7 years ago, as well as local conferences here in Minnesota, at the MESI conference, for example, I recall feeling that CRE was just like this little niche and often maybe kind of a side strand. Whereas, just in this past year's AEA, we see an example of how we're really, as a field, reimagining, right? And trying to shift how we understand both the field of evaluation in and of itself and its history and context, as well as the history and context of the work that we engage in. So as this conversation, moves forward into the mainstream, you can get the sense that we've come quite a way and that we still have quite a ways to go, right? And some of the things that I'd like to discuss in this session are some resources that I like to highlight for folks in the field to have a better sense of how to embed equity into evaluation practice. So one of these resources includes the Center for Evaluation Innovation, particularly for those in and around philanthropy. So that just this year, they released a report on what building a trust-based framework for evaluation looks like. And this work has gained a lot of traction in the field. When I was in philanthropy, it was being talked about quite a bit. And I think it's an important shift to understanding evaluation in terms of relationship building and not as it's typically, right, kind of conceived as this idea or this system of penalizing programs that aren't performing on par, right? Or so really kind of getting a sense of how we shift our attitudes around perhaps even the purpose behind evaluation. And then also looking at the Equitable Evaluation Initiative as a resource, which aims to grow a sustainable field of leaders who practice equity-centered evaluation. I find that their principles really kind of provide a great framework to look at how evaluation can be considered in service to equity, as well as having evaluation be designed and implemented commensurate with the values underlying equity work, which include multicultural validity and oriented toward participant ownership. My analysis on these principles is that they are an important kind of step in the right direction. And, in order to go further, we can look to more recent research and publications. For example, the considerations for conducting evaluation using a culturally relevant and racial equity lens. So this is work presented by Dr. Paul Elam and Willard Walker. And this work was presented on at one of the main AEA pre-conference workshops, at which I would have been at had it not been for my illness. So this provides a good framework for looking at equity as it relates to three main buckets. That includes equity as it relates to evaluators themselves in the project, the evaluation process, and then the third key element being the organizations that are being evaluated, which I think is really helpful and useful to pose the important questions for each of these categories. So for example, when thinking about us as evaluators, right, looking at our level of awareness of the cultural differences of the populations that we're working with, right, particularly the populations that are being evaluated, diversity among evaluation, among the evaluation team, right? Cultural competence, or what I like to call intercultural agility, the training of evaluators prior to or during the evaluation around these concepts, right? These are all important elements of thinking about how we as evaluators practice from the lens of equity, right? And then evaluation as a process. So this really looks at how are end users involved in the design of the evaluation. And this hopefully and ideally happens on the front end, right? So thinking about how the priority population has input in the decision-making process, how which methods are used, which methods and like how methods and tools are designed, right? Thinking about the analysis and the use and the meaning-making processes of evaluation and how folks are embedded at tables, in these important choice points or decision-making points in the evaluation process, I think are also important ways to considering embedding equity into our processes. And then the last piece is the organizations that we work with, right? So thinking about the diversity and racial consciousness of their governing bodies, organizational structure, thinking about, whether or how staff and board are reflective of the communities that are being worked with, the extent of the grantee or the organization's previous involvement in diversity, equity, inclusion work, and how that shapes their day-to-day operations, right? These are all really important considerations that we can take to understand how to embed equity in our own practice. So with that, I will pause here and open it up for reflections and thoughts. Is there anything that struck you in the information that I have presented so far? Are there other thoughts or comments or questions that folks have just in terms of their own practice in embedding equity? And my apologies in advance or after the fact for the wailing baby in the back. Please go ahead, speak in.
And I'm attempting to share your handouts if you wanted to explain anything that's in here, Naaima.
Yeah, I feel like this is pretty straightforward and self-explanatory. I think that one thing to know is that often when we think about embedding equity into evaluation, we go straight to process and like, okay, what are the design things, or like what are the considerations that we need to do in order to kind of like fix the process, perhaps, is the easy place to start. I think one thing that has come up over and over again in the rest of these sessions and comments and questions from other folks doing this work is it's often a process of learning, right? That needs to be focused on in the more broader sense, right? When we're thinking about embedding equity, often we need to start with, even just defining like, what do we mean, right? What do we mean when we're talking about equity, particularly in the context of the work that we're doing? What is the history and the context behind the issue that we're working on, that we're looking on evaluating, right? I think these are really important questions to pose, and not just questions to pose, but to create the time and the space for doing this learning is critical parts of the process of embedding equity, right? And then also just being in conversation, right, with different stakeholder groups, with different types of community constituents, right? I think these are all things that, again, require time. And if we are to be successful in actually moving toward embedding equity more thoroughly into our evaluations, my argument is that we need to carve out that time from the beginning, which I don't think we as a field have a very rigorous practice of doing, at least right now. It doesn't seem to be kind of the run of the mill, if you will, or like the way of operating where, typically you're jumping into an evaluation design process that has been set, we're already kind of in implementation. Let's go, like we're doing this from the beginning. And there hasn't been this space in the front, on the front end, right, before any of the project work begins, to really kind of consider how are we approaching equity in all of this, and what are our commitments as a group, as a project, right? So yeah, those are, I guess, the kind of the big pieces I would say are kind of hopefully reflected in some of this handout. Yeah, and I mean, best practices, I don't want to read through all of that. I don't think that's a good use for a time. Are there any other like points of discussion? Any other questions or thoughts that folks are thinking?
Lenore put some things in the chat and she doesn't always want to come on. So if you want to, if there's any reflections you have there, and I can read it to you if you want me to.
How do you, okay, yeah, thank you for pointing these out. So it says, how do you try to convince those who contract you to install embed equity when there's resistance from the board leadership? That is really tricky. And I think, you know, I like to frame questions in terms of effectiveness, right? So when we think about embedding equity, like there's a broader purpose to why we're doing it, in addition to kind of the moral imperative, right? Things like shared liberation. I think that there is a really strong case to be made for efficacy. And the fact that if we don't have the right history, context, and data informing the specific nuances that make up the communities that we're working with, because we're not working with monolithic communities, right? And so, and in order to be more effective in working with communities, I think you can make that argument, right? And you can really start from there. If there's a lot of resistance, if there is just so much resistance that you can't move forward, I would actually question, like, I would say, do we need to have a broader conversation, right, with the people who you're contracting with and saying like, hey, is this really a big commitment for all of leadership within the organization? And maybe, you know, having some honest conversations that are difficult, and yet, you know, those are the opportunities where I feel like we can take some professional risk and some ability to lean into our own privilege in terms of design and influencing design, and really have those conversations, if that makes sense.